Hello and welcome to Rotted Reviews. And it just turned midnight. Just now. It is Sunday, December 31st, 2023. It just turned midnight, New Year's Eve. I know I can fake this pretty easily, but why would I bother? The fact is, it is midnight, and I have a challenge for myself. It's born from, I don't know, cinemasochism, as well as some might be accusing me of some procrastination about this particular project.
It is true.
You see, my goal was at midnight on New Year's Day, the first moment of the new 2024 year, I would be putting out a full franchise review, because it's been about a year since I've done one. And the last one I did was of Ring. And this time I was going to be doing Paranormal Activity. So, I haven't done it yet at all. Like, I haven't, I've seen some of the movies, a few years ago, but I haven't done a lick of work for this particular video. And I was going to scrap the idea, or at least shelve it for the moment. But you know what? I'm going to do it. I have 24 hours. I'm giving myself 24 hours to watch 8 movies, 7 in the official canon of the Paranormal Activity franchise, and 1 Japanese outlier that I'm including in the mix because at this point, why the not? So this is going to have a runtime of 12 hours and 35 minutes, which gives me less than 12 hours to gather my thoughts, record the videos, import the footage, edit the footage. Once it's all done, export and render the entire project, upload it to YouTube, then wait for copyright checks and processing time. And if everything has gone perfectly well, then this will launch 23 hours and 57 minutes from now. So can I do this? I don't know. We'll see. My hard goals on this one is to watch all 8 movies and to record myself giving a spoiler-free synopsis and evaluation, my thoughts and so forth, with a score and rating breakdown of all 8 movies. And if I can add anything else into the mix, interstitials, B-roll, anything fancy like that, then I'm going to, but that's not a promise. I'm just going to see if I can possibly do an 8-movie franchise review in 24 hours. This is the stupidest challenge I've ever put myself through, but here we are. So here we go. The Paranormal Activity franchise. Let's go ahead and dig right in and let's get to the first one. I'm going to keep going and this clock is going to keep me accountable. So here we go. I'm already kind of punchy. I got my coffee. I got my seltzer water. I got my snacks and my sunflower seeds. I got my jammy pants on. Let's do this. Paranormal Activity. Roll 'em. The one that started it all. 2007's Paranormal Activity, directed by Oren Peli. This is a film that, if you know my channel, if you know me, you know that I love found footage movies. And I think it was this film, along with The Blair Witch Project that preceded this one by a fair number of years, that really cemented that for me. And I think for a lot of the audiences out there. And I think what it really comes down to is the simplicity of it. A simplicity that is probably absent in later installments. Just for reference, I have seen not all of the Paranormal Activity movies in the past, but I have seen several, and honestly, the lore is completely out of my brain. I have totally forgotten everything that happens. This is the one movie of the entire series that I have seen multiple times now. And after just watching it again, it just reminds me of what I love about it. So this primarily follows the characters of Katie and Mika as a couple that move into a new home in San Diego, California. And Mika decides to go ahead and snag a video camera and document the goings-ons because there's some unusual paranormal activity in the house. He just generally wants to capture it and document it and maybe sell it, who knows. So thus starts an introduction into the chemistry between these two characters, as well as their chemistry with the camera, turning adversarial a bit later on.
Okay, I got an idea about what we can do. Some more stuff.
Would you please just get away from me with that camera?
Now, just for a bit of historical note, this movie was filmed at a cost of $15,000, which is absolutely dirt cheap chump change, but it really does show what can be achieved with just a little bit of ingenuity. It was then shopped around for a while, and it caught the eye of Jason Blum, who then decided to go ahead and show it around. Eventually, it started seeing enough eyeballs that Paramount became invested in it and wanted to do something with it. The idea generally was to just shelve it, buy the rights, shelve it, and have the director remake it with a proper budget. And even if they weren't going to shelve it, maybe they could include it as a special bonus feature in a future DVD of the proper film. And Oren Peli was pretty on board with that. It sounds like a dream come true for any indie up-and-coming director. But he did give the stipulation that first what they should do is just go ahead and screen the movie as it was for test audiences. And they found that it was actually a bit of a surprising result because some people decided to leave the movie early. And at first they thought that they were leaving early because it was a stinker, but instead it was actually because the people were scared and wanted to just bolt, which was good enough for Paramount. They decided to go ahead and make some small editing changes as well as shoot a new ending for it. And that new ending cost $200,000, which obviously just dwarfed the entire rest of the film's original budget. Nevertheless, it got released and audiences gobbled it up. And I can see why. I thought this was a really effective film. Again, in its simplicity. This was a movie that was just kind of born from simplicity, and it really had every opportunity to just completely fall down. It's like building a really big house that's just held up by some thin legs. And hopefully those legs are made of quality material that actually can support the structure. But more often than not, in situations like this, it's just not, and it winds up collapsing into the sea. In this particular case, that foundation was sound enough. And by that, I mean the characters and the relationship between them, the chemistry between the actors. We had a found footage movie that was largely improv. They were given the general tone and the nature of what each scene needed to accomplish, and the actors were left to just riff on each other and interact in a very natural way to get to that end goal of the scene being complete and going to print. And absolutely 100% credit where credit is due. Katie Featherstone and Mika Sloat nailed it. They knocked it out of the park. The chemistry that they had with one another was top notch. That's not to say that their characters were, well, all that sympathetic. I've heard a lot of complaints about this movie, and one of the biggest ones is how annoying the Mika character was, as almost the antagonist of the film, way more than the supernatural paranormal presence that was involved. I mean, he seriously is right up there with the Franklin level of character annoying, but it works in this case. There's a lot of conversation that can kind of happen around the very simple nature of the story of the movie, the observer effect. There was the notion that within just the lore of this particular confined movie, that Katie has a history with the paranormal activity that was going on all throughout her life, and it was just kind of there. Maybe not entirely benign, but just there. Certainly not terribly aggressive. So as soon as the camera got brought into the mix, that's when things started slowly escalating throughout the course of the movie, and it really does beg the question, did the results change by observing them? Was the demon at that point angered and ramping things up, or just at the very least gaining more power by having it be acknowledged? It's an interesting question. It's a fun little conversation. And then we have the antagonistic aspect of the Mika character as he just completely bulldozes Katie's agency, not respecting her wishes and her stated desires as far as the household, the camera, the demonic presence, anything along those lines. He just goes and does whatever he wants to do, seeking way more often than not forgiveness than permission, getting a spirit board put in the house, even though she explicitly says she didn't want to, joking around about using the camera to film extracurricular activities and then trying to hide the fact that the camera was recording.
Excuse me.
What?
Camera is not off.
It's off. That's the standby light.
That is not the standby light. That's the record light.
Just a bunch of sleazebag shit which was honestly just a little tough to get past at some point, but that really does work well for the character. And there was such a good relationship dynamic between the actors that they managed to make the scenes feel very, very real. And that was the major selling point of this movie, was the implied realism of it. It doesn't have any major end credits to speak of. It's mostly just legal copyright ownership notices. We don't have big scrolling titles of the actors' names and the key grip and so forth. It's just bare bones to present itself as, we found this footage and we're showing it to you. That's it. And in that, it worked really well. I can't speak well enough of this movie just in terms of the simplicity involved. It scared the pants off of me the first time I watched it, and although it really doesn't hammer home quite as much in repeated viewings, it's still an engaging watch. I'm kind of curious to see where the sequels go. Again, I have watched many of them, but I don't remember any of the lore at this point, so I'm eager to get going with the second one, but first I got to take this recording and edit it, and then I'll watch that movie, and I'll see you in a couple hours. So here we go. Paranormal Activity 2 coming up. 2010's Paranormal Activity 2. The name of the game in this case is More. Technically a prequel, this movie takes place within the months leading up to the events of the first movie. And this time we follow Katie's sister of Christy, who lives in a nice big house in nearby Carlsbad with her husband Daniel, her stepdaughter Allie, and her newborn baby boy Hunter. This starts out with the singular camera, just like the first movie did, with Daniel going around shooting footage of everybody, until one day it seems like their house was broken into. Everything was ransacked, nothing was stolen except for one particular item that's a little bit plot relevant, so I'll leave it out. But regardless, it causes the family to get a little bit scared and install a CCTV surveillance system, thus leading the Paranormal Activity franchise firmly into the passive surveillance mode. At least partially. The characters do grab their own respective cameras, follow around, but when we do cut to nighttime, just like the first movie had the singular camera on a tripod, now we have 6 or 7 cameras peppered all around the house. And just like the events of the first movie, this just kind of ramps things up in a very slow progression with odd things happening, almost to a little bit of a exciting degree for some characters.
I don't know if the house is haunted, but I hope it is.
You hope it is?
Yeah. Are you kidding me? That would be awesome.
Why would you hope?
Until the malevolence of what was going on starts to really rear its head. So we have more characters, we have more cameras, we have more budget, we have more jump scares, we have more. Now, did it work as well? I think in some ways yes, and in some ways no. Directed by Todd Williams, this was a pretty solid watch, and I have to say that I think it was a fairly successful sequel. I do think that some of the magic that was born of the simplicity of the first movie was lost in this one, but that's to be expected, to be honest. I mean, if we just got more of the same, that would feel like a little bit of a disappointment. Where else to go but up? It's kind of the way that the tide just rolls in and out with these kind of things with just movie franchises in general. You'll have a bit of a success with the first movie that will cause them to want to make more sequels, and there's nowhere to go but up and more and more and more. So they do, until finally it gets to the point of diminishing box office returns. And sometimes when that franchise is revisited again, it winds up pulling back and going back to the original roots and going back to the simplistic route until they make sequels of that one. But for the most part, we're at the first sequel of this franchise, and it is just in the ramping things up phase. But ultimately, I think it keeps the spirit of the first one alive, and the jump scares, especially in this one, were very serviceable. This utilized a lot more in the way of sound design. So a lot of the scares were born from jump scares not necessarily even seen, just heard. The characters and how they interacted with each other were not quite as gelled, I think, as the first movie. Christy interacting with her stepdaughter Allie was probably one of the stronger points of this, but Daniel in the head of the household role was a little bit insufferable. And unlike the Mika character, it wasn't entirely always to the movie's benefit. Sometimes having an annoying character just becomes annoying. And in this case, him shrugging off every little bit of everything everybody tells him and all the evidence that is shown before his very eyes until finally he can deny it no longer. It was just a frustrating watch. But I get it. That was the point. I'd just be lying if I didn't say that it didn't grate on the nerves just a little bit more than I think it probably meant to. So this is going to jump up several points in the technical category. Just truth be told, there was a lot more to celebrate in that regard, but probably going to go down a few points in the intent category. I think that what it was trying to do, it worked fairly well. This was definitely not a failure. This was by a wide margin what I would call a success, but I don't think it achieved its intent nearly as well as the first film did. So for anybody at this point keeping track on the clock here and how this video is going to churn out, I don't know. If we're talking about 24 hours to review 8 movies, then that's going to basically allocate 3 hours per movie, watch time, record time, edit time, and so forth. So yeah, if I can get this edited by 6 o'clock, then the next movie will start, which is going to be an hour and a half long. So if the next time you see me, that clock says 7:30 or earlier, then I am well on track. But actually, I need to make up some ground because I need at least an hour to an hour and a half to render, encode, upload, and process this video. So I got to get moving. Here we go. Next up, Paranormal Activity 2, Tokyo Nights. So this was a first-time watch for me, and I have to correct myself. It is not Paranormal Activity 2 Tokyo Nights. It is singular, Paranormal Activity 2 Tokyo Night, even though it takes place across multiple nights. Anyway, so yeah, first-time watch for me. I was jazzed about the idea of this. So this is not within the Paranormal Activity official canon. It's more of just an international homage, the spiritual successor of an attempted non-licensed sequel. I included it here because this has started to kind of make a little bit more of the rounds recently, and it does make an attempt to tie into the storyline of the American franchise a bit, so I figured, why not? But the idea of taking a supernatural, paranormal, haunting storyline and putting it in the hands of a Japanese horror director, that sounded like it was going to be interesting, and, well, I'm not mad. I'm just disappointed. So that's really the big word that I can find for this particular movie is I didn't think it was terrible. I don't even think it was bad. It just was quite disappointing, and I think it missed the mark in just about every way possible. Directed by Toshikazu Nikkei, this movie follows the adult brother and sister team of Kyoichi and Haruko, as Haruko is brought home from a trip visiting America on business, and unfortunately, while she was over there, she got into a wee bit of an accident with her car plowing into an American who was on the run from just murdering her boyfriend. So yeah, the San Diego got into a car accident and both of her legs were broken in the process. So now she's home and has to spend the next 6 months recovering. Their father goes on a business trip almost right away, so it is up to the brother to take care of her. And things start happening. So, of course, the brother starts wanting to document it with various video cameras, and the movie is born. To kind of explain why this movie didn't work for me, I think we really just need to take a big step back and give a really, truly honest assessment of what the Paranormal Activity movies really are. There's no real big character development. If there are any character developments, they're largely gone by the time the characters inevitably die. There's no big reveals, there's no social commentary, there's no epic journeys, adventures, anything along those lines. This is nothing more than a meat grinder. Pure and simple, period, that's it. These are characters that we are putting into a pot of cool water and slowly raising the temperature up so that by the time they even realize they've been in a boiling water situation, they are well and truly cooked. I mean, if we were really taking an honest look at the whole franchise and the mechanics that make it work, that's all there is, but that's plenty. In my opinion, that's good entertainment. That's good horror movie, jump scare, tension building, shocking elements. For what these movies are, that's all they really need to be. So the big lift on these is to keep it interesting while that's happening. Because an hour and a half of a runtime, to have a couple of good jump scares, you need to have the audience engaged in the meantime. So within the characters of this film, it just really wasn't happening. I didn't get any chemistry. I didn't get any real anything to latch onto. These characters were just kind of there. They existed. There wasn't a whole lot to them. There was infighting about the sister not really wanting the brother to be filming until she notices that odd stuff is happening to the point where she can't deny it anymore. And then they're on board. But I mean, that's really the entire length and breadth of the conflict that was happening between the two. So not a whole lot interesting to really carry the movie between the scary moments. Which is another aspect of this that just kind of fell on its face, was the scary moments, or supposedly scary moments. So let's just talk about the formula now, because there is a fairly standard formula that these movies so far have been following, which is handycam for a lot of the daytime aspects of things where characters are interacting with one another, then static shot, surveillance camera, camera on a tripod, so on and so forth at night, when the real bad stuff starts happening, or at the very least for the first 3/4 of the movie, that's largely when the paranormal stuff is happening. So this mechanic can be used to very good effect. We have moments like in the first movie where during the still nighttime shots, we have a character just standing. Who knew standing could be so scary? But when you're having time-lapse moments and they're standing hovering over the bed in a trance, and we see the time-lapse jittery movement as the clock is winding up real fast, that was really unnerving. That worked really well. And in Tokyo Night, they tried to replicate that, but it was honestly a little bit too late by the time it was employed. The other aspect of this that works extraordinarily well within this particular framework for me is the notion of finding things in the shadows, because we're not trying to make things scary for the characters. I mean, we are, but for the most part, what we're trying to do is make things scary for the audience. So having the nighttime shots where the characters are oblivious is fine, but we want things scary for the audience. And that happens when we're largely just really scrutinizing the scene. When a character is sleeping and the clock is going very fast, and then it finally slows down to happen in real time, 1-to-1 seconds, but it's still not time for them to wake up. It's still 2:30 in the morning. We know at that moment the footage has been slowed down because something is going to be happening. So we scrutinize every shadow, every bit of movement, and so forth. And if something happens that we aren't expecting, it takes us by surprise because we are hyper-focused on that particular shadow, on that particular corner, on that particular entryway behind the doorway, anything along those lines. That hyper-fixation of that focus and then the surprise that can happen from there leads to some really good jump scares. The mechanics work by gum, except in Tokyo Night, because they just whiffed the ball on this so hard. First of all, in some of the nighttime shots, nothing happened. Nothing. It was just nighttime. Characters would review the footage after the fact, and it's like, oh, look, nothing happened. I don't care if it's just a door moving an inch, something should be happening. The nighttime shots should be tension building, and if nothing's happening, then there is no tension. There should be a sense of foreboding that even in the daytime shots, when characters are just talking to one another and things seem relatively safe, there should be that sense of unease that nighttime will approach at some point, and these characters are just getting further and further into it, and that tension was just completely broken in Tokyo Night. Lastly, the performances. It just didn't sell. Interacting with one another, it was milquetoast. It was bland. There wasn't a whole lot there, but that's fine. It wasn't awful. When it came time for the scary moments, that's when the veneer of the wallpaper paste blandness dropped and actually revealed the horrible, horrible acting underneath. It was distractingly bad. So we wound up having a movie where the downtime moments were just kind of there. The characters I didn't have any investment in, and the scary moments were anything but. So yeah, while this wasn't a terrible movie, I've certainly seen far worse. And again, I wouldn't even say that this was bad. It just was terribly disappointing. This represented both a spiritual appreciation for the original movie and a fundamental misunderstanding of the mechanical elements that actually made it work. So that's 3 movies down, 5 more to go. I'm going to go ahead and get to editing this. It should be 9 o'clock by the time I start the next movie, which means the next time you see me, that should read 10:30 or earlier, hopefully earlier. Let's see how it goes. All right, 2011's Paranormal Activity 3, 4 movies down, 4 left to go. I suppose this is just as much an account of my journey into madness as much as it is a movie review. Oh man, I don't know. I enjoyed it. I thought it was a decent sequel, but I gotta be honest, I'm really wondering how much juice there is left in this franchise to squeeze. This is not a good one to binge. This is not a good franchise to just go through one movie after another. There are franchises that are like that. Tremors is a good example. You know, it may be a lot, you know, of the same going from movie to movie to movie to movie, but at the very least, you have Michael Gross tearing it up, Burt Gummer style. This is just the same formula applied with slightly different modifiers, slightly different shticks, you know, a few more things in each one, but it's the same movie. It's the same movie all the time. We return back to the franchise and revisit the Katie and Christy characters, only this time the aspects of their history that they hinted at in the first two movies that they didn't really want to discuss, and they didn't really remember that well, even when they did want to discuss it begrudgingly. This is the telling of what happened when they were little girls. Because, of course, when they were little girls, paranormal events were starting to happen very slowly at first, ramping up in danger until the people that were sitting in a nice cool bath of water all of a sudden realized that the boiling point had been reached. Way, way, way too late. And of course, one of the characters is a videographer to set up multiple cameras for multiple angles and capture everything. I mean, I do enjoy this series. I enjoy the principle. I enjoy, you know, I don't dislike this, but it's one thing to have it to be more of the same. It's another thing to have it to be more of the same and know that I still have somehow 4 more movies to get through. So, yeah, as much as I enjoyed this, there is that looming sense of God help me on the horizon. Meanwhile, I am tired. There's a lot stacked against me right now. But, okay, just genuine thoughts on this one. This employed a few new elements that did work. First of all, we had the creepy kid element. That's always a timeless classic in horror, and it worked pretty darned well in this one, with a young version of Christy making invisible friends with Toby. And things going wrong from there, but, you know, definitely having the Toby influence cause the creepy kid factor in this particular horror movie. We also had some really good jump scares, some very quality jump scares, some very quality tension moments, which was honestly, after Tokyo Night, a bit welcome. As far as the lore, the grand overarching storyline of these girls and this family and what they went through and this demon that's following them from here to there to everywhere, it's all right. It's an excuse. It's an excuse. It's an excuse to have jump scares. It's, you know, basically it's Five Nights at Freddy's. The lore is just there to have an excuse for a movie full of jump scares, tension, static cameras with people standing over other people sleeping while time tracks fast. So yeah, I mean, in that regard, the lore is fine, I guess. I'm still waiting for a lot of it to flesh out. The storyline hinted at a lot, but was honestly sparse in the way of answers. So I guess if the franchise was going to milk anything more out of this, that would be the area to go, I guess. We'll see. Do I recommend it? Yeah, sure. I mean, as far as just a horror movie goes, it did the job. It had some really good, genuinely scary moments. Here's some complaints I'll throw this way. I think that for a movie that is latent with jump scares, if you're going to have a fake out jump scare, you have 2 rules to live by. First of all, make it good, and don't cheap out on it. Don't make it so that a character winds up just like putting their hand on the shoulder of another one as they just introduce themselves, and with a big old crash of music to try and scare the audience. That's cheap. You know, fake out jump scares, not my favorite thing in the world, but at least make it quality. And this movie did, but it also broke rule number 2, which is you only get one. If you use them too often, and more than one is too often, then it just completely destroys a lot of what you're going for. So when the second fake out jump scare of this movie hit, I'm like, well, the other major complaint just comes down to communication of characters. And this is a fairly common thing. It's not even necessarily a complaint against the movie. It's more just an irksome element that winds up in way too many TV shows and movies for my taste. and is just a really prevalent element of this particular franchise because inevitably, as the heat is getting turned up on these particular series of events, you'll have a character that is noticing them, usually the one that's filming everything, and they'll try to get other people to listen to them. And there's just this sense of obstinance, as well as just piss poor communication coming from the person that suspects the danger in the first place. There was one scene where there was rock solid video evidence. No question about it. Anybody that would see this would know that something is wrong and get everybody out of the house immediately. And he tried to show the mother character in this film, and she just wasn't having it. But the method in which he tried to show it to her was just flabbergastingly ineffective and frustrating. First, he framed it as, we really need to have a talk, so why don't you go ahead and sit down? Immediately just put her on her guard, and then started talking about witches and covens and showing pictures from the 1930s and so forth. And, by the time it even got to the notion that he had a tape, she was frustrated, flustered, and didn't want anything to do with it until she basically left the room in a huff. Why didn't he just say, hey, got something to show you? Press play. It's just maddening. It's the same thing. If you have something important to tell somebody, if you have a critical piece of information, there really is a little bit of a structure that you should be adhering to. Give the most important, pertinent information of what's going on and the degree to which concern should be shown. I don't care if it's 2 a.m. and you're calling a family member about a medical emergency. You start with the most important information. Uncle Roger fell down the stairs and broke his hip, but he's okay. And then you show the level of urgency that's required of the person that you're talking to. I just wanted you to know you don't have to hop on a plane this morning. Take care. I'll fill you in when more details arrive. And then if you want to have a big old conversation about how he had to crawl to the phone and, go through the chronological events that led you to get to this information in the first place, fine. At that point, you've laid the groundwork. Everybody knows exactly what's going on and exactly what's to be expected of them with this information. That's the level of communication that I really wish would happen more in movies and horror movies and so on, because I think if you actually manage to find a way to have that level of intelligent communication and still develop conflict and the necessary resolution for that conflict within those confines, everything just feels a little bit more realistic. Everything just feels a little bit more grounded. And you have characters that you don't want to throttle every time they're on screen. Okay, so that was Paranormal Activity 3. Up next is Paranormal Activity 4. After that, we start getting away from the numbering system, but up next is Paranormal Activity 4, and let's see. So hopefully I'll be done editing this by noon, and we have an hour and a half movie after that. So if the next time you see me, this clock back here reads 1 o'clock or earlier, then I am heading in the right direction, and maybe I can actually squeak this out. I am getting to the point, however, where the question is not going to be so much, can I do this, but why in the world would anybody do this? Paranormal Activity 4. Coming up next. All right. I'm officially not enjoying myself anymore. I am. I wouldn't do this if it was actually causing me harm, but I think that I'm enjoying the concept of this challenge more than I am the movies themselves at this point. It's the same movie. It's the same movie over and over. 2012's Paranormal Activity 4, directed by Henry Joost and Ariel Schulman, just like Paranormal Activity 3 was. And this time we go outside of California and meet up 5 years after the events of Paranormal Activity 1, as well as the last portion of Paranormal Activity 2. And meet up with a nice suburban family, mother, father, daughter, and adopted son, who find themselves into a bit of a situation when a young mother moves into a house across the street with her young son, and then almost immediately has to be taken away in an ambulance. So her son Robbie has nowhere to go, and the family takes him in on a temporary basis until the mother gets out of the hospital. And Robbie is a weird one, not really gelling at all with any other members of the family, just generally an odd duck. Following Robbie is just the whole demon thing as everything starts slowly ramping up and pot of boiling water and all that shit. Here's the thing is, for the first time in the American series, this wasn't scary. There was nothing about this that was redeeming. The jump scares were just absolutely terribly hackneyed. More often than not, we had fake out jump scares, so those are increasing in quantity, which is just absolutely grating. I find myself at loggerheads with a lot of the horror community because I will defend to the death good jump scares. My big argument is that there's not a whole lot of good jump scares to be found. They are a rarity. And any movie that employs more fake out jump scares than actual attempts at scares, it's just heading in the wrong direction. And I can see where people come from and their distaste, but I don't like grouping them all together to come up with a overall negative viewpoint on the art of the jump scare. I think that when they work, they are absolutely worth it. What a ride. But as far as Paranormal Activity goes, at the moment, the ride has halted. So stepping back and just repeating real quick here, I don't really consider this to be anything more than just fodder for the meat grinder. That, anything about this is just laying things up so that we can have the characters meet their final demise or their terribly awful, tragic demise, whatever the case may be. They're not going to be coming out of these movies ship shape. And that's fine. That's what we paid our admission. That's what we're buckled up for. But it still has to be interesting in those moments in between. And this movie, for the first time, for me at the very least, was just generally boring. Let's just go down the list. So we didn't really have anything new brought to the table except for gimmicks. And gimmicks will only get you so far. So we had the laptop chat gimmick. I don't know if this was the first movie back in 2012 to really employ that, but I've just seen it done so much better. And I mean, it's an interesting idea that we can take different perspectives and use those perspectives to deliver on some quality scares, but the movie just fell flat in that regard. It had this opportunity for that, but movies like Host did it so much better. We had the dots projection from the Xbox Kinect that was picked up on the infrared camera. Wow, that was almost just like the textbook definition of gimmick. It felt very vapid, very overused, and yet somehow underutilized. It was this common, prevalent technical aspect of the film, but I don't think ever really got used to good effect. It never really delivered on any scares, which is, if the gimmick's going to be there, at least have it pay off. The downtime between scare attempts was longer and longer and more drawn out. At some point, it's an art. There is an art to the craft of establishing the tension leading up to a jump scare. And one of the elements of that art is keeping the audience's attention, knowing how long you have to spend in that drawn out tension-filled moment before tension breaks. The real big challenge is you, the filmmaker, want to be the one breaking it with the next element, with a surprise attack, with something. You don't want it broken of its own accord by the audience just tuning out. As far as anything else goes, we have the characters. They were just kind of blah. I think the big saving grace of this film, more than anything else, if I were to give any kind of positive highlight on this, it would be Catherine Newton playing the teenage daughter of Alex. She was the one that we were following along with, that she was suspicious from the get-go, trying to convince other people of things with the help of her friend Ben, setting up the cameras, and her performance in this was actually pretty good. So credit where credit's due on that one, but every other character and performance therein just kind of played out like stiff cardboard that never really had anything interesting to say. And as far as the lore goes, this again just hinted at a whole lot. It continued on with the whole Katie, Christy, Hunter storyline, but never really answered anything, never got to any point of storyline resolution. And over the course of four of the American movies so far, so a grand total of about 6 hours of runtime, has come up with enough lore to fill up about a 5-minute synopsis and absolutely nothing more. So, man, in terms of the storyline, I know that it's an excuse to continue on with the meat grinder, but there's just nothing there. Every time they try to come up with a shocking ending just before the credits roll, it just winds up asking more questions like, well, what the f*** was even that? And I can hope that they'll answer it in the next movie, but so far they f***ing haven't. And the one thing that would save this for me at this moment would be to have some scares, for the meat grinder to actually grind some meat. That's what I'm here for. That's what this series is known for. That's what I'm buckled up for. And maybe this is my fault. This is kind of part and parcel of just burning through movies like this, is at some point you do just get a bit desensitized, you do get a bit numb, and even if you don't get that, you do just start to recognize the patterns, and everything kind of turns into paint by numbers as one movie progresses to the next. But that just makes me want in further installments to have the spirit and the mechanics of the Paranormal Activity franchise while also delivering something new, something fresh, more than just gimmicks. So maybe that'll happen in the next film, 2014's Paranormal Activity, the marked ones. I don't know. I'm not holding out hope, but perhaps I'll amend that. I will always hold out hope. I'm just not holding out too much in expectations. So I'm starting to do pretty good on time here. 5 movies down, 3 more to go. We've rounded the corner on the noon mark, and midnight 2024 awaits us soon. So let's see if I can go ahead and knock this out and get going with the next movie. If everything goes to plan, by the time you see me again, this clock will read 3:30 or earlier. Fingers crossed. We'll see how it goes. I'll talk to you in a bit. $3.44, not too bad. So I'm often surprised at the wonderful little gifts that life gives us. I don't often think that if I put stuff out into the universe that I'll have it granted, but sure enough, here we are. Within the first 5 minutes of starting the 2014 Paranormal Activity, the marked ones, I was extraordinarily relieved that my wish for having the framework and the spirit and so forth of the Paranormal Activity franchise, but something completely new, something totally fresh that's not just a new gimmick, all of a sudden it's served up on a platter right in front of me. And you know what? I couldn't be happier about it. I can see why some folks within the Paranormal Activity fandom might have an issue with this one, but honestly, going through movie after movie after movie, this was the palate cleanser that I so desperately needed. Written and directed by Christopher Landon, whose films I'm a little bit hit or miss with, but I think I always at least enjoy or am entertained by on some level. This movie follows the trio of friends of Jesse, Hector, and Marisol, are young adults that live within an apartment complex, and strange events start occurring after a high school graduation, and several of them turn 18. As far as the camera element of this, it's basically just something that one of the characters picked up at a pawn shop and is documenting his life. They record themselves riding a laundry basket down this flight of stairs. Idiot young people constantly recording themselves. It was enough of an excuse that, it's like, okay, I'll buy it. Enough said, moving on. But at least for the moment, we now have a respite from the entire movie taking place within the confines of a way too big upper middle class home with a kitchen that I would die for. And now it feels a little bit more personable. It feels a little bit more character driven and grimy and real. And that is kind of what the core of the Paranormal Activity franchise was started with, was that sense of realism. As well as stepping away from the setting, we also change up the entirety of the format. We're no longer doing steady cam, handy cam footage in the daytime while we're doing static surveillance cam at night. Instead, it's all found footage within this one singular camera as the characters are just interacting with one another, experiencing these paranormal events, and one of them in particular getting quite affected by them. This does use gimmicks, of course it does. There's nothing wrong with that entirely. There's a Simon game that goes on here where they are able to actually ask yes/no questions to the entity. But the thing that saves the marked ones from winding up in a kitsch category is the fact that it's not dominated by the gimmick. It's not ruled by it. It's ruled by the characters and the storyline and the plot and the writing elements that are imbued within, and the gimmicks that are employed only serve to really dish up the scares. Moreover, prior to this, I don't think I've really been captured by an ensemble cast since the first movie, with the characters of Katie and Mika playing off each other so remarkably well. This one felt organic. It felt natural. I was invested in the characters and their dynamic. Their relationship and their chemistry was just sold perfectly, and it was a wonderful found footage movie. I think the big complaint that could be said about it is the same exact thing that I'm using to praise it, which is that it was a significant departure from Paranormal Activity. Nevertheless, it was very strongly still within the mythos and the lore. This brought back some characters and some actors from the previous entries and solidified a little bit more of the plot in terms of answering questions that had been asked previously. Of course, we don't get off scot-free. This asks plenty of its own and has its own shocking, confusing moments that leave me scratching my head, but Sometimes these movies are just creepy for the sake of creepy, and that's plenty enough. I can forgive a whole lot of that when there's actually a captivating movie on the surface level to draw me in and engage me. Who'da thunk it? I do find it a little bit interesting, however, that although I would say that Paranormal Activity, the marked ones, is probably the more violent and adult of the entirety of the franchise thus far, it actually had some pretty brutal sequences to it, that in spite of that, it actually didn't have as many scary moments. And by that, I mean the long, tension-filled, drawn-out sequences leading into a jump scare that actually manages to work and is one of the signature elements of the Paranormal Activity franchise, number 4 aside. That really wasn't entirely present here. We kind of forego that in favor of a bit more brutality and a more visceral supernatural imagery. But again, that departure from me personally going on the journey that I have been is an absolute breath of fresh air. This was movie 6 out of 8 for me. I got 2 more coming up here, and I was really fading. I'm not going to lie. After the last movie, I was not looking forward to pressing play on any other Paranormal Activity movies for a good long while. And this has revitalized me. It has rekindled my love of the franchise. It has rejuvenated my spirit. And I'm kind of eager to see where the next movie goes. Even if we go back to the mini McMansion, upper middle class, suburban, Caucasian dreamland, I would be okay with that. I think I've gotten my second win. I feel invested in the lore again. I'm kind of eager to see how things shake out in movie number 7, which is 2015's Paranormal Activity, The Ghost Dimension. So let's give that a shot. If things are still on track for me to meet my midnight challenge goal, then this clock, the next time you see it, should read somewhere around 6:30. We'll see. Well, so I'm struggling. I'm doing okay on time, but I'm struggling in every other way. I am so tired. There's only one more movie left to go, but I just finished watching the 2015 Paranormal Activity, The Ghost Dimension, and we're back at the mini McMansion, what have you, which I said I was going to be fine with, and for the most part I am. What I wasn't entirely fine with was the biggest departure yet from everything that made this core series great. What once was just a nimble, lightweight roadster that was perfect to take out for a track day at the races is now just the epitome of bloat. The first film cost $15,000 to make, and yeah, it had a $200,000 remake of the ending, but all told, the entirety of the Paranormal Activity franchise, up to and including this movie, has had a budget of $18 million, which is oftentimes a fraction of one singular movie's budget. So this is, again, a franchise born from simplicity. But of that $18 million, this one cost 10. This one cost more than all the previous entries put together, and a lot of the magic was lost in the process. So we're picking back up within the most modern, chronologically told story of the series, and we're with a new family in a gargantuan house, which we come to find out was built on top of the land where Katie and Christie's house once stood before burning down. So this is going right back to the old formula of the slow progression of haunting events that is being tracked with a camcorder and eventually goes into multiple cameras taking static surveillance shots. Only this time the camera that's being strapped to people's shoulders and walked around with happens to be a ghost viewing camera. The father found a box of doodads left over from the previous owners, including a camera, videotapes, and so forth. So there's a kind of like Paranormal Activity meets Sinister in its own way. The camera seems to be specially modified, having more LED lights and tubes built into it, and can view the world beyond and lift the veil and so on. It's another gimmick, and really the only useful aspect of its nature is to give form to the creature and entities and so forth that had previously just been the invisible, malevolent spirits that I think worked pretty darned effectively. I don't know why we needed to see it. I don't know why we needed to have elaborate CG monster effects. I don't have anything against CG. I've often said that, be it practical effects or CG effects, use every tool in the toolbox to the best desired outcome for your film. But while the previous entries may have relied on CG to do some cleanup and have people thrown around the room in convincing fashion by the invisible force, this one instead just makes another CG movie monster. This is absolute Hollywood horror bloat at its worst. I was honestly kind of scratching my head because just looking ahead, I could see that there was a 6-year gap between this movie and the next one, Next of Kin, in 2021. And for the life of me, I couldn't really figure out exactly why that would be. These movies are so budget proof. All you got to do is just make a really simple $2 or $3 million Paranormal Activity movie, and you'll at least earn 10 times that much with a dwindling box office, and it may wind up being a runaway smash. But now I can kind of see why. This just completely the bed. And I'm sorry, I am tired, I am punchy, and I don't really feel like holding back a whole lot. I don't mean to be overly negative, but this was terribly disappointing. This was directed by Gregory Plotkin, who seems to be known more for his editing work, including on the Paranormal Activity franchise, than directing work. But even so, I mean, I don't think it was necessarily the fault of direction with this. If I had to guess where blame might lay with this, I would say chances are it's going to be in the writing and in the studio notes. And considering that this was written by Jason Pagan, Andrew Deutschman, and Adam Roboto, that kind of makes sense. And I have nothing against any of them. The latter in particular is actually a fine director. I've enjoyed his work with Escape Room, Insidious, The Last Key, a few other, more mainstream, bloated horror movies. But regardless, when you have a movie that falls flat on its face to the degree that Paranormal Activity: The Ghost Dimension does, it kind of makes sense when you see that there's more than 2 writers attached. You get the idea that this was a movie that was made by committee more than passion. And here's the weird thing is, for all the visual effects that were put into this movie, I don't think that it was the best looking of the bunch. There were some effects that were pulled off in part 3, part 4, and especially in the marked ones that were jaw-droppingly good. And maybe that was born from having a limited budget. Maybe that was a situation of necessity driving the creativity. That often is the case. But stepping aside from the budget and the bloat and the effects, I think the lore also kind of suffered with this one. This introduced some new elements of training to cross between dimensions, including through time, and it's just getting to the point of muddled mayhem. So far, this entire series has been building its storyline piece by piece, movie by movie, by introducing very small, brief hints at an overarching conspiracy and the people behind it, only to pull back when it actually came time to really explain things, answer any questions, get into heavy exposition, anything along those lines, and then blow it all out of the water with a big final gotcha scene before end credits rolled, until it was basically, well, we have these hints that the movie laid up, and then we have this big punctuation mark, so maybe the next movie will tie it all together, and then the next movie kind of does its own thing with its own hints and its own punctuation mark until we kind of have this cobbled mess, and this movie really just muddled those waters even further. I have a pretty good idea of the chronology of the events with the movies, where each one fits within the timeline relative to the next, but as far as all the lore surrounding the ancient midwives coven and what they want with the firstborn sons of families that are willing to give them up, and the daughters that they're training to be a part of this coven or a part of this army and travel between dimensions and become possessed by the demon and then the demon himself and all this. It's just all vague and twisted and shadowy and nebulous. And man, I was just hoping that 6 official movies in, I would have a little bit more clarity than I do at this point. But there's one more movie left to watch. Maybe that'll answer all the questions that are still burning in my head, such as what is actually going on? Will I be able to finish this? Will I be able to stay awake? Will I get this done before midnight? Time will tell, but things seem to be on a pretty good progression with that. So let's go ahead and get into the last movie of the Paranormal Activity franchise so far, the 2021 movie, Paranormal Activity: Next of Kin. 2021's Paranormal Activity: Next of Kin. The plot has been totally lost at this point. There does come a time, I've done many of these franchise breakdowns now, where I can kind of tell that something needs to give. The franchise needs to stop, or it needs to have a 10-year hiatus and then get rebooted, and we are just firmly at that point in Paranormal Activity. By all accounts, it doesn't look like they're making any more. There's at least no immediate plans in the works, and by God, that's just the best news in the world for me right now. It's not that this was a terrible movie, it's just that it wasn't a Paranormal Activity movie. I think that as a mainstream attempt at a high budget found footage-esque movie, yeah, worked pretty well, not too bad. Some good monster scare elements and so forth, but it just doesn't feel like this fits. Written by Christopher Landon and directed by William Eubank, this movie follows the character of Margot as she goes along with her production crew of Chris and Dale. You see, Margot is a documentary filmmaker, and her next project is herself. She was given up by her mother at the hospital doorstep when she was a baby, and has finally, through a genetic test, found her family and her lineage at an Amish farm. So she wanted to go there and ask about the way of life. Anybody remembers her mother, anything along those lines. She's basically turning the life that she's wanting to pick up the breadcrumb trail on and find out more about herself. But of course, not everything is as it seems when she finally gets to this Amish farm. She ingratiates herself as much as she possibly can to the locals, and they begrudgingly allow cameras to film them under some caveats and so forth. But yeah, the nefarious plots and hidden secrets and so forth start emerging from there, and it all kind of somewhat-ish ties together with the Paranormal Activity lore, kinda. Out of all the movies in this entire series, I would have to say that this is the one that is the biggest visual departure. It has a very clean cinematic style to it, and I don't really think that that actually works in service of what it's trying to do. This movie doesn't really seem to embrace the found footage perspective. Instead, it wants to use some elements of it that create the jump scares while not respecting a lot of the others. It'll have a character put the camera down so they can accomplish a task only to have something foreboding happening in the background outside of their vision, but we, the audience, pick up on it through the camera lens. That's perfectly fine. It's a tried and true technique of found footage, but at the same time, it also wants to have the most polished, professional, Hollywood, documentary-esque visuals in the entire world, while at the same time also overlaying big jump scare sound moments. It's the same as having a soundtrack playing that's not actually happening within the scene, like on somebody's car stereo and so forth. So yeah, those little moments just pull me right out of the movie. As much as I enjoy crisp, clear, sharp HD visuals in my horror cinema, I would have to say that found footage is not necessarily a format that benefits from it. Quite the opposite. The thing that the first Paranormal Activity movie really embraced that made it work so fucking well was the realism aspect. It looked like somebody just grabbed a camcorder, documented what was going on in their house, and got way more than they bargained for. Very clean, very simple, very real, and that's what sold it. The further we get away from that, the more monsters we add, the more clean Hollywood-esque visuals we add, the further away we get from that realism aspect, and the further away from engagement I have as the audience. The characters in this were actually pretty alright. The chemistry between the three main leads was not bad. The foreboding, ominous nature of the local Amish folk worked really well. This was actually filmed in Allen, New York in Allegheny County, which is less than an hour away from where I live. And the setting, as bleak as it was, really does remind me of the winters around here and all the farms and the Amish folk and their buggies on the road. So there was a nice little connection there for me. Again, as a standalone horror movie, had some good visuals, had some good characters with some interesting dynamics and chemistry with one another. It was a found footage movie that wasn't too scared about breaking its own laws at any given point. It did have some fun jump scares and wasn't afraid to go with the bonkers monster route, which I can appreciate, but it just wasn't a Paranormal Activity movie. The score is going to reflect it as it is, as a singular film, just like all the others within this series. But my words and my thoughts and my feelings that are conveyed outside of the score it just doesn't feel right. And if I didn't feel like the ghost dimension should have been the death knell for this series, which, by the way, I do, it's definitely hammered home with this one. Paranormal Activity should And it should at the very least give a good long pause, regroup, remake, back to the roots, but not for a very long time. I'm hoping that this will be the last Paranormal Activity movie I review for at least the next 10 years, but we'll just have to see how that goes. Now I'm going to go ahead and get to editing this, and once that's all done, I'll start recording the conclusion to this series. So catch you back up in just a moment. All right, so that is all 8 movies watched, reviewed, and scored. So let's go ahead and tally up the numbers and figure out how they fared. So in order from least to greatest, worst to best, we have Paranormal Activity 2, Tokyo Night. After that, Paranormal Activity 4, Paranormal Activity 6, Ghost Dimension. After that, the race gets a little tighter with Paranormal Activity 7, Next of Kin, followed closely by Paranormal Activity, the original, then Paranormal Activity 2, which was eked out just slightly better. Again, the production quality definitely helped with the technical aspect. And then Paranormal Activity 3. And the heap and helping top of the ladder for me in this entire franchise was Paranormal Activity 5, the marked ones. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on this. Let me know how wrong I am. I'd love to hear from you. In the meantime, what I'm going to go ahead and do is put the final finishing, polishing touches on this whole video. And then hopefully within the next 2 hours, I can render and export it, upload it to YouTube, get it processed for HD, and release it. There's no guarantee. This is all kind of up to my computer and God and whoever else. So tell you what I'll do is if I can get this released and scheduled for midnight so that everything is all locked up nice and tight as a drum before then, I will go ahead and post on Instagram the timestamp of when I came in under the wire, along with the hashtag Cinemasochist. So if you really are interested in finding out if I actually beat this 24-hour challenge, that would be the best way to check. Anyway, that's it. I'm done. I'm going to go ahead and finish this up. And Happy New Year, 2024. Yay! I'll talk to y'all soon. I'm going to get some sleep. Good night.